Hi, this is Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Erin, and today I'm going to present Read to Write and Write for Your Reader. Okay, so in this workshop today, we're going to be covering several topics. We're going to start with reading and writing in their broader context. We'll then move on to some common issues with reading and writing that I found in my classroom. We'll look at how to read to write, how to write for your reader. I'll suggest some classroom activities to help you with both of these points. And finally, we'll do a little bit of reflection at the end. Okay, so let's talk about reading and writing in a broader context. As we know, reading is categorized as receptive, along with listening, whereas writing is categorized as productive. Now, with this, there sometimes comes a misconception that reading is a more passive skill, whereas writing is the active one. Now, I agree with this to an extent because, of course, with reading, there's not so much choice and there's no creation involved as there is with writing and speaking. But I think a good reader is an active reader. And for the purposes of this workshop, I want to change the categorization of receptive to perceptive. And that's because I believe an active reader is someone that brings some world knowledge and insight into reading their text, and they keenly observe what the text includes. And with this kind of insight and perception, we're bridging that gap between reading and writing. And this is what I mean by reading to write and to write for your reader. Okay. So before we move on, I want you to ask yourself a few questions to frame this workshop in your teaching context. Do your students seem to have a block on navigating some texts? So perhaps they can read competently in some situations, but some texts kind of throw them off balance. And do your students sometimes cope well with reading, but they don't demonstrate the awareness of these texts and the appreciation of what goes into good writing when they're doing a writing task? And finally, do your students seem to be unaware of the crossover, the connection between reading and writing and these transferable skills? Okay, so if you've answered yes to one or more of these questions, then don't worry, you're not alone. And this is why today I'm going to suggest that if we focus on that crossover between reading and writing, we're going to be able to solve some of those issues or work to a better place with them with our students. So let's start with some common issues with reading. So here's a text that I've used many times in my classroom before. And when I show this text, I might ask this question: what can you see? It's a common question. We're trained to ask students this, to activate schemata, to engage them. And it's a valid question, but it doesn't always get answered in the way that I expect. Sometimes I have students that will say simply beach. And whilst you can have fun with the pronunciation of this one, it doesn't really show any learning or any insight into this text. So it's simplified. On the other end of the scale, you get students who will say, what's the word for this? So it's natural that we look at something and we have this quest for knowledge. We want to find out new words. But this student here is focusing on the unknown instead of looking at the bigger picture. You might also get students who do this. They might say, what mean, or what does humidity mean? And with that, they're owning in on the unknown, and they're also neglecting the co-text. They're not looking at the bigger picture and putting it all together. They're just focusing on something they don't know. So what I'd argue is that students are missing that balance. Most students won't get that balance between seeing the bigger picture and then owning in on the details on their own. And that's where teachers come in. This is something that we need to negotiate with them and help them be more aware of. Because if learners aren't aware of this balance and they're not exploiting details from a text, how will they learn for it? If they're just saying beach, how will they learn from this? It's not pushing them to the next stage of their learning. They're missing new concepts, new ideas, new vocabulary. If they're not paying attention to the bigger picture, how will they understand its purpose? If they're wondering about beach huts and humidity, this is valid and they are learning something new, but perhaps they've missed that this text is an advert. And we need to think about this context to understand it fully. And outside of just practicing reading and writing skills, if our students are not competent in reading and writing in these skills, these strategies, these sub-skills, how are they going to perform well in assessments? Most of our assessments are in written form and they include a variety of texts. Certainly in my context, in the ESOL world, a lot of the exams that we use, so these are functional skills, they involve real world texts. And if students aren't adept at kind of navigating them, they're going to miss out on opportunities in assessments that are key to their kind of progress. And also, if they're not experienced in reading and writing in a variety of texts, how will they cope outside the classroom? And this is the main goal, really. So what I would suggest instead is to ask your students to be a detective. And what I mean by this is to encourage your students to investigate a text as a whole, to physically look left, right, high, low, to zoom in for that detail and zoom out again to get the bigger picture and then look once again. And this is essentially a student-friendly way of getting the gist, looking for detail, and not reading every word, because as we know, a good reader is experienced in moving around a text, a bit like a pinball machine. And with this, being a detective, we're actually thinking about text analysis. So let's look at text analysis and let's use the same advert. And instead of saying, what can you see? We could say, let's be a detective. Let's look at the layout. Think about the images, the taglines, the font, the numbers, the figures, the icons, any info we can grab from around the text. And then we need to look at what kind of text it is. And we can usually do this from the layout. We can see here, this is an advert. And we need to think about who the reader or the audience is. So in this case, it's going to be somebody who's looking for a holiday. And therefore the purpose, if we put all this together, is to sell holidays to the Maldives. Okay. So by looking at the bigger picture and the details, we've kind of put these main things together and analyzed our text, which puts it all into context. Okay, so with text analysis, we can go a little bit deeper. We can look beyond the surface level, and we can use this information about it being an advert, the way it's laid out, who the reader is, and what the purpose is to get more information, detect more. So we know that when we look at language, register, and style, these should feed into the layout, text type, reader, and purpose. We can see that the language, we might have some new words, like humidity, for example, but it should come in context. So we can work out what it is from thinking about the bigger picture and the surrounding words and images. Because it's an advert, we know the register is going to be more informal. Or if we think about the style, we could say that it's more direct. And we know this because there are minimal words. It's supposed to be eye-catching. And the way that we've got this could be you, it's quite striking. We don't have to think about this in terms of step by step. We can also think about it in a circle. They all inform each other: the layout, the language, the register, the audience, the purpose. However way you want to look at it, we need to think about how they are connected, because this is reading actively, and it's bringing in our real world knowledge and the way that we read in the real world into the classroom so that students can use it outside as well. Okay, so when we say be a detective, it's essentially a simplified way of getting students to read for gist, for detail, to skim, and for scan. And this is what our training tells us to do, and a lot of course books and textbooks tell us to do, and it's completely valid, but it's not always the most memorable for everybody. Personally, I like to think not necessarily about the detailed words, even though they are separate subskills and strategies. I like to think about it holistically. And this, by framing it this way as detection or investigation, seems to help my students really kind of get to grips with what is expected of them when they read actively. Okay, so let's consider a little bit of theory. TAVI. If you've not heard of TAVI before, this is using the text as a vehicle for information. So essentially, we're doing what we did before. We're looking at the bigger picture, we're appreciating some details, but essentially we're thinking about what this text is overall, putting that all together, building a picture in our minds, and expecting it to be a certain text. We're predicting, we're using our prediction skills. And that's based on what is known. Okay. And then if there is new language or new linguistic features to discover, we're learning this naturally. It's happening as a result of TAVI, or of our text analysis, of being a detective. So we're starting big and we're getting smaller. Okay, so another approach is TALO, using the text as a linguistic object. And this is essentially using the text as a kind of store for lots of different grammar or vocabulary. And course books ask us to do this a lot, to look at the text and perhaps do a little bit of comprehension, but then to focus on what the text offers us linguistically, which is definitely important. But to do this first is not so realistic. For me, this is something that should come later, after using the text as a vehicle for information and seeing the bigger picture. And students, when they're left to their own devices, if we don't intervene, they tend to TALO, as I showed you before. They might look at the advert and they might say, what does humidity mean? Rather than looking at what they can see and what they know. Okay, so if we do want to use the text as a linguistic object, which of course we do, we want to do this with a bit of text analysis. So we've come through this bigger picture, being a detective, and now we're owning in on more detail. So we're going to break down parts of the text and play with it. So I would take this part of the advert. For example, this could be you. And I might ask students why this is uppercase. This is a reflection of many of the functional skills exams that I use in my context at the moment. So asking, why is it uppercase? What's the effect of this? Or what effect does the exclamation mark have? Or maybe in terms of vocabulary, which phrase could you replace it with best? So there's some critical thinking skills here, an option of choosing which one sounds better, which one fits better for an advert, which one is more tempting, more persuasive, which one sells to the reader of the holiday maker. So again, we're going back to the circle, or this step-by-step, this continuous involvement with text analysis. It all feeds in together. Now, if you ask those questions without looking at the bigger picture, without using TAVI, this approach, if you just gave the students this text and asked them these questions immediately, do you think they would be very good at answering them? I don't think as well, at least. Okay. So this is why it's really important to put this together and think about the order that you're approaching a text, what tasks you're giving your students. Okay, so let's put all of this together so far. We've been looking at the crossover between reading and writing and what I would call mainly text analysis. We've used TAVI and text analysis. We've then used TALO, looking at specific details, and text analysis. And if we put this together, if we're being a detective, we're creating an environment where our students are starting to become more perceptive and more active readers. Okay. So I'm going to throw another slightly cheesy, but hopefully memorable analogy at you. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm sure you've thought of this before, but just in case, let's think of writing as cooking. We basically need to add the right ingredients to cooking. Yes, we need the skill, but we also need the right ingredients, the right elements, the right key features. Again, we're thinking about that crossover of texts. So we're going to think about some common issues of missing ingredients in writing. I'm going to show you two messages that were sent to me by my real students. And I want you to be a detective. I want you to investigate, and I want you to see if you can find any missing ingredients. I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to do this. This is text 1, and this is text 2. Have a look at both and think about what the missing ingredients are. 10 seconds starts now. Okay then, so hopefully you've detected some missing ingredients here. Let's have a look at them. Okay, so you might see something about formatting or spacing that's caught your attention and seems like a missing ingredient. Perhaps some vocabulary issues, wrong word or spelling issues. It could be some capitalization issues as well. And there are lots of other grammatical things that we could improve. But I think essentially, despite those errors, the meaning comes across pretty well from the students. I would say that the main issue, the main missing ingredient, are the greetings and sign offs. You can see here, we have Dear Erin, which is great in a letter, but not really in a quick text or Teams message about not coming to class. Wishes, regards, it's charming, but it's not standard. We've got Hi, Miss Vickerman, which is kind of informal, formal. And then my name repeated again in the same sentence, but then there's no sign off at the end. So with these, there's some really important missing ingredients for this text type. I'm focusing on text type dependent ingredients. These things, the missing greetings or the incorrect greetings and sign-offs, this is what jars me most as a reader. It's not the grammatical and lexical and the punctuation issues and the spelling issues. It's this side of it, the text type ingredients. If they're missing, I'm jarred as a reader. And this is what I'm talking about, the crossover from reading and writing. If students are aware of this when they're reading messages, they're more likely to produce them. Okay, here is a task or some instructions that I gave my students once. I'm just going to give you 5 seconds to have a little investigation of that. Okay, and here is a real response from a student that I got. When you're reading this, I'm going to give you just about 15 seconds for some very fast detection. And I want you to focus on missing ingredients, but I want you specifically to think about the text type missing ingredients. Okay, so here's the text, 15 seconds to find the missing text type ingredients. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully we're in agreement. There are grammatical, lexical, other spelling, capitalization issues at play here, that's for sure. But in terms of the text type, I would say that this is an article and there's no introduction for this article. And the article should be about two different areas in London. So I'm expecting an introduction that says, I'm going to compare this place in London and this place in London. You get the places later on in the text, but it's a bit jarring at the beginning. So this key missing ingredient for this type of text creates a lack of coherence and cohesion, and it throws you off balance. So basically, this student didn't write for their reader. They knew what they were thinking, but they didn't write for their reader. They didn't make it an easy read. So what we need to be doing is with any text, we need to notice the ingredients, because if students have tasted these ingredients when they're reading actively and they're seeing the effect, they're more likely to include these ingredients in their own writing. And when they produce writing with the key ingredients, it shows an awareness of the text and better purpose. Basically, if they have this experience, they're more likely to write for their reader. Okay, so I'm now going to suggest some classroom activities that you can use to help your students taste those ingredients and get more aware and more experienced of their text. So increasing exposure, a great way to do this is a gallery walk. So you want to set up your classroom as if it were an art gallery. But instead of art on the walls, you want to put some texts. You might have an article, a letter, an advert, a text message, a Teams message, it could be a label, it could be so many different things. Now, when the students are walking around the room, you want to give them some purpose, because as we know, when students are left to their own devices, they rarely get the most out of an activity. That's our job. So we want to really push their active reading here so that they're going to be better at producing articles, letters, adverts, and messages, or whatever you're putting on the gallery. Now, it could be a simple warmer. You could ask students to walk around the room with a partner and give them 10 minutes to read all of them, shout when they need to change to the next text. And you could just ask a simple question like, what do the texts all have in common? And it may be the content. And then you could say, but what makes them different? And this could introduce a topic, but it could also highlight that difference between the texts. They may have the same topic, but they're all presented and all written differently. But if you want to own in particular on any of these texts, for example, guided discoveries are going to do what they say. They're going to give them more guidance and more purpose in this task. So here's a text. It's very long, but I think even while I'm talking to you, you've probably been a detective and you've worked out that this text is a letter already. And we know that from the layout. We may not know the full content, but we've got those skills already. And this is what we need our students to do instead of struggling with words that they may not know. Now, imagine this letter is on the wall in your gallery. The students might be walking around with a task card like this. So they might stop at the letter, text B, and with their student partner, they might say, okay, what type of text is this? And hopefully they will say that it is a letter. Question number 2, who wrote it? We can't always answer this question, but it does lead into good discussion. You know, who wrote an advert? Well, someone in advertising, and then that kind of opens up a new lexical area for students. But particularly with correspondence, you want to know who it's for and who wrote it. Students can mix this up. So I often ask students this, even if it's not suitable directly for this text, but it is for a letter. And you'll notice that from question 1 to question 2, it's kind of jiggled around in the text, and we're getting students again to read like a pinball machine, looking all around. And what is it about? It's about a complaint. Again, I'm getting them to understand the purpose of an introductory sentence. And you can see from the rest of the questions, I'm moving them around the text, and they're all text analysis, TAVI style questions with a few tallow questions as well. Number 9, for example. A different way of doing this is to give students even more purpose and practice their note-taking skills. So they might move around the room with their partner using a table, and they may make notes on these questions. So they're practicing their note-taking skills as well, and their summary skills, and their spelling skills, and their writing skills at the same time. And you're going to ask questions like, what type of text is it? And you might also, moving down, do the same thing as I did before, sending them around the texts and thinking about different areas at different times. And when it comes to tallow, so the linguistic object, which they might be keen to start with, you want to try and change that and leave that to the last. So they're looking at the bigger picture and they're moving down to the detail. So can you see any new words? Copy them down. Okay, what do you think they mean? You're encouraging them to look at the bigger picture, or maybe the co-text, the surrounding text from the word that they're in. Okay, another thing to do is to use builders for writing. So when we're asking them to produce on their own independently, we might want to give them a builder or a recipe to keep this analogy going. Before I showed you this set of instructions, which I gave to my student, who responded semi-successfully, but they were missing that introduction. What I would say is that my mistake here is that my students hadn't been exposed to enough articles at that point. They didn't really know that they needed an introduction, especially if it was comparison. So that was my failure there. And the result was that the student didn't produce the best text they could have. So give them something like this instead. Kind of looks a little bit like a recipe, actually. You've got the points at the bottom. When you give them something like this, give them a little bit of time. So I'll give you 5 seconds for investigation. Be a detective, see if you can work it out. Okay, so hopefully you've read the question, and by reading, I mean reading actively. So you've detected these important elements, or you've analyzed the question, as we often say, and now you should know what's required of the students, and they should know, if it's given to them, that they have to write an article. So I've given them the text type. I've told them how to approach it to compare, but I've given them some specific ingredients that they must include. They must have an introduction. They must have comparatives. And there's many other things that you could include there as well. So I often find that students respond much better to specific detail in their tasks, actual ingredients, key ingredients, not every single ingredient, correct spelling, correct punctuation. You can do that if you want to focus on that. But when you're talking about a text, let's just start with the text type, because this is far more realistic. Okay. So if we think of writing as cooking, we need to remember that we can't create a dish, we can't cook this dish if we haven't tasted the ingredients. And recipes tell us what ingredients we need to use. So again, it's going around in a circle. It's this crossover between noticing, actively reading, analyzing, and producing, because we know what the ingredients are. We know what makes a good text. We're reading to write, and we're writing for our reader. So if students have noticed, analyzed, been a detective, everything I just said, they know the ingredients, but what they produce will be more considered, more competent. They know that they're writing because someone's going to read it, and it needs to be easy for that reader. They need to think about that connection, which is why other examples of activities like finding the errors in a text are also really good, because it draws students' attention to what's missing. So the activity I did with you, with the student's response, that of course is a great activity to apply to your classrooms with your students as well. So if they are aware, if they're being more considered, more competent, they're going to write for their reader. Okay, finally, to reflect, I've given you 2 analogies to consider and lots of ideas like text analysis. So reading and writing are much more than text analysis. I'm not saying it's this simple, but I'm saying it's a very good start. You need to train your students to read actively and perceptively. It's not a passive skill. It's an active skill, but you've got to bridge that gap with them and help them to be more autonomous there. And then finally, you could use simple and effective frameworks, memorable, slightly cheesy, but approachable analogies like being a detective and having recipes and the right ingredients. And this, if you put them together, is going to bridge that gap, hopefully. Okay, so if you'd like to access some resources or see any more of the workshops, then I recommend the Gallery Teachers Library, which has got lots of fantastic information. And why not become a pro member as well, so you can access more of these workshops. I mean, by read to write and write for your reader, that plenty of students are not really doing this. They may be competent readers and they don't tend to struggle with reading, but when it comes to writing, they're missing many of the key ingredients that they would need to produce in their texts. So it seems like when they're reading, they're not reading consciously, they're not actively looking at what is required to make a good text, and then they're not carrying that through to their writing either. So if we are getting students to notice and appreciate what goes into a text, then they're more likely to write more competently and write with their reader in mind, so that their reader is clear on what this text is about and what it's for. When there's little or no reflection of how students read or write a text, the experience becomes very passive for the students. And when it's more passive, it becomes more temporary. And there's plenty of missed learning opportunities there. And really the lesson, or that moment in the lesson, is poorer quality than it needs to be. If we do reflect, we make that process more transparent. And then if we know what strategies we used with a text, either to read them or write them, we can use these again and again. So we're basically creating autonomous learners in our classrooms. And I think specifically for reading and writing, teachers really need to get the students to reflect. Because if they don't look at that crossover between a written text, how they're reading it and how they could write one of their own, then they're not understanding the ingredients that are necessary. And if they don't have that, it doesn't read well. And therefore they're not writing for their reader.